Instructions to get subtitles in French and Spanish will follow shortly.
Comment ajouter des sous-titres dans votre langue? Étape 1. Cliquez sur l'icône CC en bas à droite de la vidéo pour activer les sous-titres. Étape 2. Cliquez sur l'icône des paramètres. Étape 3. Cliquez sur sous-titres CC 1. Étape 4. Cliquez sur Génération automatique. 5e étape. Sélectionnez votre langue. À ce stade, vous devriez commencer à voir des sous-titres dans la langue que vous avez sélectionnée.
Cómo añadir subtítulos en tu idioma. Paso 1. Haz clic en el icono CC en la parte inferior derecha del vídeo para activar los subtítulos. Paso 2. Haz clic en el icono de configuración. Paso 3. Haz clic en subtítulos /diagonal CC 1. Paso 4. Haga clic en autogenerar. Paso 5. Selecciona tu idioma. Selecciona tu idioma. En este punto deberías empezar a ver subtítulos en el idioma seleccionado.
So I've got a really important question. There's the section in the video about the sensitive information and the exception to report, and yet you have to disclose that you have taken advantage of the exception. So David Wortham says, the requirement to disclose that the organization has taken advantage of the exception to report on sensitive activities is a great invitation to oppressive regimes to investigate, like a red flag. So I guess the question really is, and this point has been well made in focus groups, in discussions, but, you know, it's a really important and very valid point. So how did we arrive at the position that we presented in the exposure draft? Philip, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, thanks, Sam, and thank you for the question, David. It's very relevant. We've been on quite a long journey with this, and there are, I think, of all of the parts of INPAG, this has probably provoked the strongest reactions on both sides. If we start with why we've included the sensitive information exemption, as narrative reporting is going to be mandatory, we didn't want to put NPOs in a position where they had to report on information that could put either service and goods users or staff and volunteers at risk. The question then is whether, if an NPO is leaving information out, they need to note that information has been left out or not, and how much they say about the sort of nature of information that has been left out. I think there's a sort of general consensus that we do need to allow NPOs to leave out sensitive information. Our practitioner advisory group strongly supported that, and we held a very specific narrative reporting focus group where we discussed this issue as well. So I think in general, people agree, if this reporting is mandatory, there has to be some kind of exemption for sensitive information. Initially, we had NPOs not having to put anything in their reports, but our technical advisory group, I think it's fair to say, were against this with various levels of strength, because they were concerned that this exemption could then be used as a way of hiding poor performance or financial issues that may have arisen, and that users needed to know that something had been left out, because that they weren't getting the full picture of what the NPO had done in the year. The best solution that we could come up with to sort of square that circle was that NPOs would be able to leave things out, but that they'd have to report that they'd prepared the information in accordance with a paragraph. So just a reference to a paragraph number, no information about the actual nature of the activities, the nature of the sensitive information. And that's the kind of consensus opinion we've got to. I would agree, it's not a perfect solution. I'm not sure there is a perfect solution to this, which is why we have included in the specific matters for comment a question as to whether NPOs should be allowed to not disclose sensitive information, and if so, whether the sort of compromise position we've come up with works. This, I think, is where the sector's voice needs to be heard. We've come up with a technical solution which has broad support across our advisory groups. we need to know if the sector thinks this works or not. I think, Sam, you're still on mute.
We've kicked off with one of the most knotty issues on this topic, and really would love to hear your ideas. Not just whether you like what we've got, but if you have a suggestion for any other way of doing it that you think might be acceptable to different stakeholders, we'd really love to hear that, because we're, it's been a difficult one. I'd like to ask a follow-on question from that, which is really, why is the whole report, the whole narrative report, mandatory in the first place? If it wasn't mandatory, we wouldn't need this exception, and many jurisdictions don't have mandatory reporting for narrative commentary. So yeah, how is that decision reached?
Shall I start, Karen, and if you'd like to add anything? NPOs, I'm an accountant. Financial statements are obviously great and very important, but NPOs don't exist to generate financial returns for stakeholders. So the financial statements don't give users the full picture of what the NPO is trying to achieve, in a way that, say, for a private sector organization, there isn't quite that issue. So we, in the consultation paper and throughout the development of INPAG, we've always been quite clear that one of the core principles is that there has to be this broader reporting for NPOs to be able to demonstrate both financial and non-financial performance, and so that the reports really do meet users' needs for accountability and decision making. That was very strongly supported in the feedback we had back in the consultation paper. We are aware that it is sort of pushing the boundaries beyond what normally international financial reporting frameworks require. But I think this is somewhere where the sector really can lead and show that users actually not just want this information, but they need it. It has to be provided. So that's where the mandatory nature came from, noting that it is mandatory and that this is sort of pushing the envelope. We have looked to make it as user-friendly and as adaptable as possible, so that it is very much focused on what users want, and that we are not being prescriptive given the huge diversity of NPOs and what they're looking to achieve.
Thanks for that. I don't have a lot to add. I think you've said it all there. I mean, I think, you know, the feedback that we've had from stakeholders, both in the consultation and outside of it, was very much this language around, well, the narrative information is as important, if not more important, than the financial information, because for non-profit organizations there's so much focus on the outcomes, the activities it's doing and the outcomes that are being delivered, and that needs to have prominence in the financial reports, and that's, you know, why we've gone down the road that we have. There was lots of discussion about whether it should be mandatory or optional. But the strength of view that has gone into our consultation process so far has landed on, you know, the side of it being a mandatory requirement. But as Phil said, we've tried to make it proportionate and scalable, so that it doesn't create a huge burden for NPOs with a vast swathes of narrative information. We've tried to keep it to a common core that non-profit organisations can then build on. Of course, there are questions about this in the exposure draft, and we would very much like to get people's feedback about the proposals that we've outlined.
Super, thanks, Karen. And now you mentioned just in your answer there about activities and outcomes. That takes me very nicely to David Hardage's question in Australia. Am I correct in understanding, he says, that the focus of performance reporting is on activities rather than outcomes? Now, obviously, in the NGO world, it's much easier to define and talk about what you've done. Many outcomes might be outside your control. They depend on other stakeholders and other factors. So it can become quite hard to report and even define these things. So what is the intention? Should the performance reporting be about activities or outcomes, or both?
So I can start with that. It will depend on the NPO. It will depend on how the NPO manages its own performance, what it's looking to achieve, what its users think are important. So in the implementation guidance, we note that it really is going to depend on what the NPO selects as its performance objectives, the nature of its activities, and whether it wants to focus on inputs, outputs, outcomes, impact. We have really tried not to be prescriptive here because there definitely isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. But what we would say is what's important to the NPO's management and how it is run is probably going to be the best way of reporting externally to users as well. Because I'm sort of from the school that what gets sort of looked at by management is what is getting done. And if that is important to management, then that should be also important to users of the financial reports.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. I mean, it's a lot about how the objectives of the non-profit organisation have been framed that will drive that. I mean, I think I think most of the conversations I have with non-profit organisations are about making a difference and about improving outcomes for the people that they're engaging with. So that's kind of always a bit front of mind. But I think in terms of being able to report on outcomes, I think it depends on how you framed your performance objectives and whether you are trying to influence something that is within your control or outside of your control, and so it needs to be appropriate for each NPO.
Right, so one of the reasons we haven't been very prescriptive is to be able to accommodate that vast range. Super, thank you for that great question. And another fabulous question. So now, again from David, so that was on the performance reporting part of it in terms of what the organization's doing. Now there's this thing about the commentary on the financials and the analysis. And it says if you do quote numbers from the financial statements, but you want to make adjustments to them, for example, you might want to talk about your general reserves and you might take your unrestricted but take out assets or whatever it is, but you want to make some changes to those numbers to make them relevant. He says, are those, is it only the adjustments that you have to disclose, but also the comparatives, with the comparatives requirement coming from the general requirements? So if I make an adjustment to the numbers this year, do I also need to give a comparative in the same way?
What I would say is yes, if you can. If it's a material enough number that you're making an adjustment and disclosing it to users, that users' understanding is going to be improved by providing a comparative. If for any reason it is not possible, we do have a general requirement for consistency from section 3 of INPAG, if I'm correct. So generally NPOs should report on a consistent basis, reporting period by reporting period. So if for any reason that you cannot provide that comparative, try at least and be consistent year on year on the kind of numbers that you are reporting on, because then users can look back and may be able to determine that information themselves, or at least have a good understanding of the sort of how that number may have changed over the course of the reporting period. But ideally, if you are adjusting numbers and they are material, users' understanding will be improved by providing that comparative, and we would support, I think, quite strongly the provision of that comparative number.
So another question sort of linked to that, you've both David and you have referenced sort of aspects of the nature of information and, referring to adding value with comparatives and things like that. So it said in the video that we're using the same sort of qualitative characteristics about the value of information for the narrative report that are also applied to the financial statements. Is that really valid? Why have we used the same qualitative characteristics to apply in both those reports?
I think for us, when we're looking at the general purpose financial report, it's not integrated reporting, but it is an integrated document. And the way we've looked at, say, reporting of performance information in even financial objectives, we want the document as a whole to be linked, integrated, for it to be easy for users to understand. When we were examining the nature of the information that was going to be provided in the narrative report, I think we were struck actually that the qualitative characteristics of financial information were useful and could be applied to non-financial information to enable that sort of integrated approach. So we have the high-level principles that it should be the same reporting NPO, that it should be for the same reporting period. And then once we're at that position, looking at this as a kind of integrated document, we think that the same qualitative characteristics do apply. There is, though, some additional principles on top, and that is the requirement to make the report fair and balanced. What we don't want is a narrative report that sort of takes away from the integrity of the financial statements. So that the financial statements generally are prepared in accordance with fairly strict accounting standards, and will provide a true and fair view of the financial position and performance and the cash flows of the entity. We don't then want a narrative report, which is a very sort of almost like a promotional set of material that doesn't provide a true and fair view, effectively, of how the entity is performed as a whole. So I think our view is that these work, but we would welcome feedback to see if that's the view of the sector as a whole.
So if I can just add to that as well, I think, one of the things that we were thinking about, given that this is something that's not part of current international standards, was around simplicity. For many nonprofit organizations, this might be a big step change in adopting INPAG with lots of new things to learn. And so we thought that there was benefit in being consistent across financial and non-financial reporting, given we think that that they are both relevant and applicable across both. Just changing the names or nuance would be unhelpful. At this point, if people can learn one set of new terms and then apply them equally to both financial and non-financial reporting.
Super. Now, you touched on something else there, Karen, the sort of burden of taking on a whole new raft of financial reporting guidelines and formats, and at the same time, a whole burden of providing this narrative report. Isn't that going to be too much for NPOs to take on all at once when they adopt INPAG? What are we doing is there anything that we can do to mitigate that?
Karen, I can start that if that's okay.
Yeah.
So we have feedback from the consultation paper was that while this is very much needed, there was a recognition that this could be a stretch for some entities. Things like the reliability and even just getting data, the capacity and capability of NPOs to do this, as you've alluded to, Sam, at the same time as potentially moving to accrual accounting as well. This is something that we are very conscious of, and it is something that I've been very conscious of while drafting the requirements. We've looked to ensure that this is the kind of information that an NPO should already be collecting, should already be reporting. The proposals are adaptable to the individual NPO. We aren't putting in, other than these sort of high-level framework and principles, we aren't putting in very detailed requirements as to what needs to be provided. And we have also looked to provide fairly extensive implementation guidance and examples and best practice from around the world, so that NPOs can look at those and use them when looking at what the authoritative guidance says and how it will be applicable to their individual circumstance. That said, we are aware that this could be a burden while also looking to implement the rest of INPAG. So we have included, following discussion with our advisory groups and the focus group on narrative reporting, the possibility of an extended transition period for narrative reporting. So this would permit an additional 2 years for entities to apply this individual section of INPAG while still remaining on being able to say they are in compliance with INPAG as a whole. The decision was no transition period, no extended transition period, 2 years or potentially 5 years. We felt 5 years was too long, but we think this 2 year is quite a nice compromise. So again, that is a specific matter for comment, and we'd welcome feedback from the sector on this.
Super, thank you. And we've had another question in from David. Thank you for plastering us with questions, David. About the verification, the audit, the assurance associated with this narrative report, which is again a really important question. He says, I missed if this will need to be audited, so please can you clarify that? If it is part of INPAG, then I guess it will need to be, but possibly not a burden if there's only a real minimum that needs to be met. The minimum for publicly listed companies is not really very much, but many make it into dozens of pages. So you've got this, you can sign off that the minimum requirement has been met, but is that the same as saying all the information in this narrative report is reliable and go ahead and read it with confidence? What's the assurance plans around this narrative report?
Karen, should I start?
Please do.
I mean, we do not dictate in this the level of assurance that should be applied, either actually to INPAG itself or the sort of financial statement elements or narrative reporting. I think that's outside of our remit. What I would say is I'd expect this to be the kind of sort of more limited assurance kind of engagement where you are looking to check consistency between information that's in the narrative reporting side and the financial statements. You're looking to make sure there is nothing there that says contradictory, and ensuring that, say, where you have manipulated information that's in the financial statements, there is that clear audit trail as to why it's been done and how. What may happen is that the performance information included is subject to forms of assurance already. If this is the kind of information that, say, an NPO is providing to a grant-giving organization, there may already be forms of assurance that grant-giving organization requires the NPO to do, that it could rely on for the information. So, David, yeah, you didn't miss it. It's not there, but I think that would be, from my perspective, that would be the sort of good compromise approach that would sort of match what happens for public sector organizations and publicly listed companies, and would ensure that there is a small burden, but it's not overly burdensome, to ensure that there is a decent level of assurance around the information.
I think that's right. It's not, I don't think, for us in terms of developing a set of guidance for the sector to comment on the audit arrangements for it, or set that out. I think that is for the audit community to determine. But I think Phil is right. I think we would have the expectation that there would be at least some degree of consistency checks performed, so that anything in the narrative report, particularly given the scope of it, that it is consistent with what is in the financial statements. So I think that will be a conversation that will need to develop as these proposals get refined and taken forward.
Great. I've got one more question I want to squeeze in if we can. It's a really good one from Wilfred in Kenya. I thought that the various donors state what needs to be reported in the narrative report, as they give a template for this. Will we come up with a standard template for the narrative report? I think this really speaks to this push and pull between donor requirements and special purpose reports and the more general reports. So could you speak to that? Great question.
If I start with the beginning, Karen, and then if you'd like to mention the sort of broader work around the supplementary statement, maybe. We don't think a standard template will work given the diversity of NPOs and what their users want and the kind of performance objectives they have. What we do think works is this sort of broad framework to ensure that certain things will be included, and that those items that are included are subject to certain principles, but it allows the NPO to really tell its own story through the narrative report in a way that best chimes with its users. There is, though, some additional work with donors that Karen may want to mention now around more standard templates. Yeah.
For those of you who've attended any of the earlier webinars this week, you may have heard me mention work that we are progressing to look at supplementary statements that NPOs can choose to use if they want to provide information about projects or programs or grants. We are working up these proposals as part of ED3, so they're kind of under active development at the moment. And we're thinking about a range of things that could form the base of those statements, including things like comparison to budget. And there may be additional information that we want to put aside that in terms of narrative information as well. But a bit like Phil says, these will all be about principles. I think we are really trying to avoid templates because the variety of NPOs and how they operate in jurisdictions is just so diverse that a template could become a straitjacket, and we would want to avoid that. So we're looking at in pretty much everything we do is a principles-based approach to doing that.
Ram's put one. Let me give you Ram's question. How will the financial statement commentary differ from note disclosures? So there'll be notes accompanying the financial statements, which add a lot of information, and yet we've got this section in the narrative report that's a commentary on the financial statements. How will that add more value? How will that be different?
So Karen, if I start and then you can add. So I think the note disclosures is very much driven by the specific financial reporting standard related to whatever transactions and economic events are covered by that note. So, for example, if there is a note on fixed assets and their valuation that would show potentially the valuation of a fixed asset with its current value compared to its historical cost, that is very useful information, but that is very much driven by that individual financial reporting standards requirement. Our financial statement commentary, the way we see it, it's much broader. It's getting more into the heart of it's almost like, I don't want to say pitch because we don't want these reports to be a pitch, but it's almost like telling the story of the finances through the commentary in a way you don't get from a dry financial reporting standard. So while the current value of a piece of property, plant and equipment is very interesting, what does that actually mean? How has that differed? How does that over time impact on how you are delivering your services and goods to users? What are you doing to ensure that your property, plant and equipment values are sensible for an organization of your size, that you are putting money into reserves potentially to finance their replacement in the future? So I see financial statement commentary as much broader. It's drawing on the information from the financial statements, but it's really bringing it to life more for the lay user rather than the technical accountant who can go in and tick and say, excellent, you've given us the disclosures that we have to, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah, I think that's really, and I think there is, I think that's really helpful for the way you've explained that. And I think one of the things that we're really keen is that the financial commentary, the narrative, is not a rerun of the notes to the accounts. They serve different functions and purposes. See that the notes to the accounts is much more transactional in nature in terms of talking about what has happened in the reporting period. I see the financial commentary, as Phil says, sort of telling the story. So if you like, bringing it up a level, and actually setting out what those transactions mean in terms of what the NPO is trying to achieve. So it's about putting, as Phil said, meaning to the transaction rather than just saying what it was, and you know, how it helps the NPO in terms of its performance or its financial objectives.
Brilliant. And I can add an example from reports that I've seen. One of the most looked at parts in the reports is commentary on the level of unrestricted reserves or general reserves and the strategies. You know, we're at this level, this is 3 months worth, we aim to have 6 months worth, and this is what we're doing. You're really adding value and perspective on the numbers rather than just repeating them. So that's a really important question. There's a follow-on question from Jose Hernandez in Venezuela. What will differentiate the financial commentary in the narrative report from similar reports, such as sustainability reports? Now, I'm not quite sure which sustainability reports Jose is referring to. Will there be a commentary on sustainability aspects in the narrative report? Okay,
so I'll answer it both ways in case the reference is to sort of financial sustainability and if the reference is to broader sustainability. So if it's to do with financial sustainability we'd see as very much part of the narrative report. We are requiring NPOs to note their financial objectives and strategies, and a sustainable financial position and a sustainable view of finances linked to the performance objectives of the NPO is very much what we see as being a core part of what our mandatory core of requirements would require NPOs to report on. Broader sustainability is a very interesting question because we have had many debates, both internally and with stakeholders, as to whether we should actually require sustainability reporting within this report. The feedback from the consultation paper was that it was recognized that this is very important, but that this would be potentially an additional burden on top of all the other requirements that we were bringing in at the same time. Our practitioner advisory group and our focus group were also very much in favor, I think, of including sustainability reporting elements. But the position we've come to is we think it's just a little premature at this stage for us to require it. As these international sustainability standards are being developed, at the moment they're very much private sector oriented in terms of the sort of application guidance available with them. That is changing, hopefully. There is public sector reporting requirements coming out, and there are NPO specific areas being looked at. But right now, we think it's just a little premature to include sustainability reporting in this core as a mandatory requirement. There is nothing stopping an NPO from implementing those guidelines and including it within this report. There are aspects of our mandatory requirements where sustainability would fit very well, to do with performance information, long-term financial strategies. It's all very much integrated. But what we are not saying at the moment is that you must include it, because we don't think the guidance has been developed enough for the absolute broad range of NPOs out there that we would feel comfortable putting a mandatory requirement in now. That said, this is an ongoing process. So by the time INPAG is ready in 2025, we may be at the position actually where sustainability reporting guidance has come on enough that we could look again at this issue. I hope that is a sort of long and also succinct way of answering Jose's question. If not, please put in the chat and we can continue, because I think it's a fascinating area, and we do want NPOs to be leading in this area.
And can I just add to that? I mean, I think there is, generally a discussion about what sort of sustainability information should form part of general purpose financial reports, because when you start to look at impact type of information, it can get very long and in depth, and we wouldn't want a general purpose financial report to be overwhelmed with that kind of information. Phil used the word kind of integrated reporting, and that probably is where we are in terms of our thinking, things that help integrate and bring together all of the factors that affect an NPO's existence are the right things to be there. But there is a global debate about this across all sectors that is playing out, and there is a great opportunity for us to kind of listen and learn from that debate. But as Phil says, if an NPO, if it's really important to a particular NPO in terms of the kinds of activities that they do, that's not a problem to include it in there. We just feel at this point that it shouldn't be mandated for everybody. Stan, you're on mute.
Yes, I just realized. Thank you. Thanks for that. And as you say, this is quite an in-depth area. We could probably talk about it a lot. There's some more questions coming in. Marco says, what kind of, you talked about integrated reporting. What kind of integrated reporting are you referring to there? Maybe let's just pick that one up briefly.
Karen, should I begin?
Please.
So in the consultation paper, we put forward an option of actually requiring NPOs to apply the integrated reporting trademark framework. That is a specific framework for reporting that looks a little bit different to what we have here, but it is used by NPOs. We've included in the exposure draft links to NPOs who have applied integrated reporting and integrated thinking. And where NPOs do have the capacity to do that, because it's a sort of mindset change, and it is a way of applying integrated thinking into the organization and not just the reporting. Where NPOs do have the capacity and capability to do that, we have said that is fine, provided the mandatory requirements of our guidance is met. And a integrated report should meet all the requirements of our guidance. When we talk lowercase I integrated, we're talking about bringing together the performance, the objectives, and the finance together in a way that's understandable to users, not necessarily applying that very developed integrated reporting framework.
I don't have a lot to add to what Phil's just said there. I think the general point about integration is joining the dots across different parts of what the NPO is doing, so that you're not just reporting on something in isolation. You're looking at the relationship between different activities that an NPO is doing, or different impacts that it has, so that you can see more holistically what impact the organization is having.
Super, thank you. I'm sure that's a conversation we can continue. Moving tack a little bit here, there's a question from Martha about this area of permitting non-disclosure of sensitive activities. And she's asking if you can give us some examples.
Yes, we've steered away from giving specific examples in the actual exposure draft because it will very much depend on the nature of the activities undertaken by the NPO. I'm normally wary of examples because people will either think that's me or that's not me, so this is not relevant. But in terms of the principle is that it's situations where there's a risk, including physical harm to the NPO staff or to those that rely on its services. or whether could there be a significant ongoing disruption to the NPO's operating activities if information is publicly disclosed. A hypothetical example, say you have a lifeboat organization that is saving refugees at sea. Very important work, but a disclosure of those operations where the lifeboats houses are, certain individuals who are opposed to the saving of refugees at sea may use that information and then either say attack the lifeboat workers or attack the property, or potentially be waiting when that lifeboat returns with refugees because they know the kinds of areas that they're serving in. That's the kind of activity and the scope of geographic activity and the identification of individuals and localities that we think might fall under this sensitive information, but it will be very much dependent on the individual NPO. What it is not permitted for is poor performance. So if that same lifeboat organization had lost 4 ships at sea because they had not been upkeeping them in accordance with, say, a donor's wishes and had funneled the money that was meant to be spent on those elsewhere, not disclosing that would not be permissible because that is hiding poor performance. It's not because there is a physical risk to individuals or a risk to the NPO's activities because of that potential physical risk. So hopefully that gives you the kind of example that I have in mind when I'm thinking about this.
You want to add, Karen?
No, absolutely. I think Phil's covered it. There's nothing I want to add to that.
Other examples that have come up during our advisory group discussions and focus groups have more of political twists, things like reproductive health services or LGBTQ or that, which have different very strong opinions, even animal research, medical research that uses animals, things like that, where the environment where the NPO is operating could have different attitudes to it, and that could be dangerous for them. So that's the general idea. Great question.
Sorry, can I just want to pick on something. I think there was a question related to this, perhaps to pick up about who decides when to apply the exception, and that is the individual organization. I think, as Phil said, we haven't tried to produce a long list of examples because it is very activity and location specific. What is acceptable culturally or legally in one location may not be in another. So it's a judgment that the NPO will need to form and make its decision based on that. That's not something that we can say it's there's a red line, or if it's X then it's one way, and if it's Y it's something else. That's an area of judgment that needs to be formed. So I thought I'd just pick up that point.
Not mentioning specifics in the guidance for exactly that reason, and so it's very important. Let me move to something now about you mentioned about mandatory requirements. Can I ask why is the whole narrative report itself mandatory? I know in many for-profit requirements the narrative aspect isn't mandatory. It's a lot of additional burden at the same time as some NPOs are trying to maybe take on board accrual accounting and whatnot else. So why, what was behind the decision to make the narrative reporting mandatory?
So I think very early in this project, I think we realized that the nature of NPOs meant the financial statements on their own just wasn't enough. If you're going to meet the requirements of users, their accountability and decision-making requirements, if you're going to be transparent, if you're going to show stewardship, you have to have that broader perspective of what the NPO is trying to do, because it's not trying to generate financial surpluses to give to shareholders. It is trying to achieve a purpose, which is very different to a sort of run-of-the-mill private sector organization that is applying IFRS. Feedback from the consultation paper on this was very strongly in favor of including narrative reporting. What we've tried to do is to ensure we have a framework and principles-based solution that can be applied by NPOs in a light touch way. There isn't a lot of mandatory individual requirements in there. We've looked for things that an NPO probably should already have. It should know who it is, what it exists for. It should know what its financial strategies are. It should know what its risks are. So our hope is that actually NPOs will just be taking information they already have, be that performance information, financial information, and just then presenting that in a way that is useful to a general user. That said, we have recognized that, particularly for those organizations that are moving to accrual accounting for the first time, which is another core principle, that this could be quite a challenge, getting the data, building capacity, training staff. So there is a proposal in the exposure draft that this area of the guidance specifically will have an extended transition period. So entities or NPOs will be able to comply and state compliance with IPSAS while waiting another 2 years to apply this specific section, so that their narrative reporting can then effectively catch up with the quality accrual accounting, which we hope that they'll be doing for their reports.
I just to kind of add to that, I mean, I think you could say that this is quite contentious, including a mandatory element within the core of the guidance. But I think it was put to us by some stakeholders that the narrative information was just so important, and for some, I think, as has been said, more important than the financial statement information. And so we are responding to that, but we are trying to, as Phil says, make it principles based rather than rules based. We don't want a checklist that says you must include this list of things. We're talking about the types of information that should be included, so that each NPO, because the sector is so diverse, can then think and look at what is appropriate for them. I see there is a question about is it expected to provide forward-looking information in the report? And I mean, general purpose financial reports are generally backward-looking, reporting on the period that has just happened. And I'm hoping Phil is not going to disagree with me here, but I think the intent in terms of the mandatory requirement is that it provides information that matches the same reporting period that is in the financial statements. So by that way, the mandatory element is also backward looking, covering the same reporting period, commenting on what did they plan to achieve and what they actually achieved over the period that's just finished. Of course, if an NPO thinks it's highly relevant to set out future plans, particularly if it's talking about forward strategies or forward objectives, then it is able to do that, but that doesn't fall within the mandatory requirement. I'm seeing Phil nod, so I'm feeling much. Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking the one area where potentially forward information would be most relevant is the discussion of risks and uncertainties. So if there are key risks, say an NPO very much relies on the public to fund its services, and it is already aware that there's a high possibility of an economic recession. That sort of forward look that we are aware that our funding may be reduced. So we are looking to mitigate that by diversifying our income sources, by looking to, say, rationalize the services we provide. That's the sort of area I think where forward information might be relevant. It's not sort of projecting forward numbers as such. It's just looking to the future based on the information you have now and giving an idea. Because obviously, I mean, by the time reports come out, what was relevant at the reporting date, you could have moved on quite substantially from then. So it is tricky, but I think that's one area where forward information might be most relevant.
Super. Thanks, Karen, for spotting Bill's question. Sorry, Bill, I hadn't seen those. Well done. I think they've all been covered. So with that, in our last few minutes, allow me to share my screen again, and I'll give you some information about how you can get involved. So it's really been very interesting to hear your questions and the types of issues that it's brought up. And we welcome your thoughts on any aspect of the exposure draft. But the project team has drafted specific questions that we're particularly keen to get your feedback on. They're called specific matters for comment, and they're in a document called the invitation to comment, which is available on the same page of the website and is translated. So to share your voice, you go to this page on the website and submit a response to the exposure draft. www.ifrfornpo.org/have-your-say. There's also a very short form that the link is going in the chat now. And if you can complete that, even now, just to let us know that you intend to submit a response, that would be incredibly helpful. It's not a firm commitment, but it just lets us know who is planning to share their views and working on a response. And we can then support you with the relevant materials and encourage you not to miss the deadline if you're planning to submit a response. I would like, yeah, there it is in the chat. So please click on that even now. It's very, very short and it will let us know. Now, in terms of looking ahead, the next 2 exposure drafts are planned to be released around the end of, well, let's say Q2, the end of June, and Q4, 2023. Feedback will then be used to draft the final guidance, which we expect to issue in 2025, ready for adoption and use. And you will receive a follow-up email with links to the slide decks and the videos and the various website links that you'll need. So final remarks, thank you so much for joining us on this journey to improve the quality, relevance and consistency of financial reporting in the sector. Please do share your voice and shape the future. Do stay in touch with us by visiting our website, following the project on social media, reading our newsletters, and of course you can always email. Final word of thanks to Karen Sanderson, Philip Trotter and Brian Menya, and all of you joining today, as well as the many volunteers who supported us in the translation of the resources. Thank you so much, and we'll give you back 3 minutes before your next meeting, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.